Greetings. Welcome back. Today I want to talk about something I've been meaning to talk about for quite some time, and it's only going to be tangentially related to what I talked about in the previous two videos, although in fact related, just tangentially only. And it will be off the cuff. Old school Stardust, if you will. So what I want to talk about today is fairness, pardon me, and justice. Specifically, well, more specifically, I want to talk about the issue of fairness with regards to human beings, society, the world, and so on and so forth. Now, it is kind of related in a way to the Elliot Rodgers killing spree. I mean, he talked about how it was all unfair. And issues of fairness run the gamut from not being able to get laid to rights of education, wealth, poverty, competitive shooters, that is gaming, what's fair, what's not. And over the years, through observation and reflection, it's just become patently obvious that there is nothing that is fair, at least not in the human sphere, save, as Elminster of Shadowdale once said, the great leveler, death. And we all succumb eventually to annihilation. That's the only thing that's fair in life, and that's the end of life. But as long as we live, there is no fairness. And whoever's listening to this, of course, might think that I am representing some particular political side. I'm not, although undoubtedly I am much, you'll probably hear this as I continue to speak, I'm much less sympathetic to the cause of the left than I am the right with regards to this specific issue. But I think both sides are in error, at least partly, in their perceptions. And I don't want to talk too much about that right now. But so the question is, what is fairness? And this is, of course, related to achieving equality under the law, things that MRAs like to blather on about. It seems rather obvious, perhaps even patently obvious, if you just open your eyes and look around at the world, that there's no such thing as fairness in any real sense. There's not even really, I would argue, a perception of fairness. The reasons for this are fairly simple. I mean, we're all different. We all have a different genome, a different environment, different luck. This composition of different factors all coming into play, ending up with a result that is highly differentiated, say, for me than it is from you or from some other person. I mean, even as I make this video, it's not particularly fair that I'm in a position that I am, born where I was, whereas some child was born in Mogadishu in 1994 and is either dead or maybe a child soldier by now. So, that is Somalia, in case you didn't know. There's nothing fair, inherent, or external to human life or life in general. And even though it's patently obvious, even though it's just so readily obvious to anyone who thinks about it, it's a bit odd that human beings react with such intense distaste or even hatred, and certainly envy when issues of unfairness come up. And no doubt this is part of a long-standing evolutionary mechanism with regards to, say, food distribution and just surviving in small groups, when it was essential that some level of cooperation was achieved, and also essential that mitigating particular selfish desires for the sake of the collective was a key solution for survival as well. Because if some individuals were favored over others, the entire system might break down. And this is really important if you're just living in a group of 12 to, say, 20 individuals. There will be sacrifices that are made in the name of the collective for the sake of survival. And so fairness, I think, ultimately, the concept of fairness must arise from this basic idea of being able to distribute goods, in this case, food, resources, shelter, in a, at least as far as the perception of the people is concerned, in a fair manner, quote unquote. And I think this system of equal distribution, and this is a hypothesis, in small groups, small hunter-gatherer groups, must have been very useful and vital for the sake of survival, and persisted for so long because it was so useful and vital. But as time went on, and as humanity expanded, the human species, Homo sapiens, expanded, it more and more became less about just who gets the mammoth steak or who gets this this particular shelter or the nuts and berries gathered, and it became more and more about bigger issues as society, human civilization became more and more complex. Caste systems, different wealth, poverty. It wasn't just about distributing food and shelter resources. So ultimately, I think this is where the whole concept of a anger and resentment towards perceived unfairness comes from. Because within the small context of hunter-gatherer groups, it makes sense that you can sort of eke out some definition of fairness. Each individual gets a certain amount of meat, a certain amount of nuts, gets to sleep under this shelter. But once you move beyond that, when the world becomes increasingly more complex, and this is a side note, but the world's always been complex. It's just that we weren't in a position until comparatively very recently to understand the complexity. As time goes by, and the human world itself, in terms of its social structures and organizations, becomes more complex, but also our perception of the world, our understanding of the world becomes more complex. The fairness complex, as I like to refer to it, remains intact, but it overextends itself and projects itself onto a new plane of reality that is far more complicated, far more complex, and far more detailed, and really impossible to ameliorate in the same fashion as it would be in a small hunter-gatherer group. That is to say, it's quite easy to give X amount of individuals so much mammoth steak, and say this shelter can hold 3 people, so these 3 people go here, and that shelter holds 2 people. That's a lot easier than trying to address iniquity and inequality with regards to this guy has more money than I do, he has better access to education, this person's getting into this program, so on and so forth. It becomes, that sense of fairness overextends itself. Because, like I said, it's possible to be reasonably fair in the sense of equal distribution within the context of a small hunter-gatherer tribe or group. It becomes a literal impossibility when we reach the macro scale we have of billions of people living on the planet, a huge civilization, and one dominant animal species, that is Homo sapiens, we the human ape. Very, very difficult. So this is a good example, in terms of fairness, of how our, as they say in German, Urinstinkte, our original instincts, primal instincts, have carried over into modernity, leaving us at a disadvantage, I think. Because the fairness complex affects us all. I've done my best to shrug off the shackles of this complex, and most of the time I'm successful in this. But every now and then, of course, it's natural as a human being on a deep instinctual level to feel that so much this and that is unfair. But over time and through understanding, I tend not to get bothered by this anymore. And key to issues of fairness are issues of envy. Not to be confused with jealousy. In modern English, the words are often conflated. In fact, they seem to be synonymous. They're actually not. At least until comparatively recently, jealousy was specifically referred to in the familial context or the lover's context, whereas you are envious of others' goods and abilities and so on and so forth. Don't go on a tangent there. But Shakespeare rightly once called envy the great green monster, the green monster envy. Why he chose green, off the top of my head, I do not know. But in any event, envy, of course, is as a abstract feeling or abstract description of the feelings one feels when one recognizes that the world is in fact unfair. And of course, this feeling must have originated at some point in time in the past in a similar context to the context that I had mentioned, the hunter-gatherer context, where maybe two individuals were getting ripped off and they were only getting an eighth of the mammoth steak and others were getting half, or something like that. So that's also inherent to human beings. But as much as we have these inherent feelings, which certainly served to safeguard the tribe, the sanctity and the integrity of the tribe for the sake of reproduction and continuous survival, they, in my humble opinion, do a disservice to us, modern human beings, and modern civilization. And let me explain why. So I've spoken about complexity and the modern complex world. The world has always been complex, but now that modern humans in the year 2014 have arrived on the scene, things become doubly complex in many ways. And I specifically talked about fairness in the context of resource distribution. And that's one element. I mean, the entire conflict, ultimately, the rages on between left and the right, and the anti-Marxists versus these purist people who think that the invisible hand people, and I'm of neither camp, actually. I don't think there's an invisible hand, and I don't obviously agree with Marxists either. This is a question of, well, fairness with regards to resource distribution, and money is just one resource. And of course, there are other elements. There's pure ability, there's pure talent, and that's also unfair. So even though we have these inherent feelings, we know, we can just observe. You don't even need to be that bright to see this, that there's nothing fair about some person being taller than someone else and as a consequence earning more money just because he's taller, or some person being born a hell of a lot smarter than another person, or some person being born, quite frankly, with a silver spoon in her mouth. There's nothing fair about that. Now, that can be universally acknowledged, and then you have the conflict between, say, these two sides. People on the left, Marxist or any sort of intermediary form between, say, a hardcore Marxist and someone who's a centrist with left-leaning tendencies, would say, we have to redress these ills, specifically with regards to resources. They don't talk a whole lot about anything biological or inherent, but I'll get to that in a bit. By wealth redistribution, affirmative action, quotas, all these things, and in doing so, we make the world more fair. Now, I think both sides, and particularly as I talk about the left right now, tend to be guilty of at least a lack of acknowledgement of collateral damage. Since the world and human beings living in the world, since this amalgamation is just inherently unfair, whatever you do will not be able to remedy a lack of fairness, and what you're going to get is like what I like to refer to as fairness collateral damage. So clearly, if you have a set of quotas or affirmative action in place for a certain program at some prestigious elite university that requires a certain ethnic group or gendered sex group to to be present there in a certain amount of numbers, certain quantity, and someone else gets pushed out, even though likely his ability or even her ability is greater than certain representatives of that other ethnic group. What you get is effectively fairness collateral damage. And I've actually had a conversation with a friend of mine about this. I would describe him as an extreme leftist, probably ultimately. No surprise. He's gay and he does comparative literature at Yale, but he's a good person. And we have semi-friendly arguments all the time. But yeah, he acknowledges in a rare moment for someone of such an extreme political polarity the collateral damage, but he thinks it's ultimately worth it. You don't hear that very often from people talking about these issues. On the other hand, and I'm certainly much more sympathetic to people on the right in this particular issue than I would be on the left. I think Thomas Sowell put it really well once. He said, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs, and effectively that's what we have with fairness collateral damage, and that's also what we have with everything we try to do in an attempt to ameliorate our circumstances and improve them. Someone's going to win out or get an upper hand or gain an advantage, and someone else is going to lose something. That's just the way it is. So, I mean, and therein lies the rub, and therein lies this whole notion of class struggle, at least with regards to resources. The trickier issue, the thornier issue, is with regards to inherent resources, that is, inherent talent. I mean, we have this. People on the right, for example, will say, people on the left people on the right say that people on the left confuse equality of opportunity with equality of outcome, and I agree with them, but on this partly. But the problem is there's also no equality of opportunity. There's no such thing as equality of opportunity. It's impossible. There's just if nothing is fair in life, save death itself, then consequently there can be no equality of opportunity. There is no level playing field. Whether it's due to greater access to resources, which allows you to acquire better education, inherently greater IQ, better athletic ability, whatever. There's no such thing as equality of opportunity. There's nothing fair about that. So that's a mythology I want to dispel in talking about this as well. So where am I on this spectrum? Well, I'm certainly much more sympathetic to the right-wing cause, and I'll explain why. I do disagree with it, the claim that there's equality of opportunity. There is no equality of opportunity because we're all different and we're all superior and inferior in different ways. But we have to think about things in terms of the aggregate. On aggregate, we still want, for the sake of humanity, the best doing what it is they're best at. I mean, I would never dream of wanting to be placed in a position of incredible responsibility, totally incompetent as I am. I mean, I'll give it a really extreme, almost laughable example. But let's say there was some wacky system that came into place in our civilization. They say, well, everyone should enjoy positions of authority, and they say Stardust should be assigned the position of head of the nuclear engineering plant. I mean, I'd probably get millions of people killed. And this is an extreme example, but it's an example, I think, that illustrates the point well, that you want people who are competent, who actually know what they're doing, rather than not. And you want people who are, if two people are doing the same thing, you want the person who's better at that to do the job, because whatever the outcome might be, it'll probably be a better outcome, whether that's for an individual company, for the individual, or for the world at large. And is that fair? Well, no, because it's not fair that that person was born with a better ability or more wealth or whatever. But in aggregate terms, that's going to be more beneficial to the world. And is there going to be collateral damage? Sure, there's going to be fairness collateral damage in the sense that someone else who might have only been slightly inferior will be quite possibly completely locked out and excluded from the avenues of opportunity that a somewhat superior individual had access to. And that's pretty unfair. But really, what can you say other than, such is life in this particular context? That other individual might be able to find something else to do, but that opportunity might not be as great as the one afforded to someone else due to his superior ability or his superior financial resources or whatever. It doesn't really matter. I mean, there's this. I think this is mythology. This idea that wealth should not be a determining factor, but raw ability should be. And I think it's partly mythological. Which I do think that raw ability is more important than having access to wealth. But the idea that there's something fair about having unique inherent abilities that none of us have done anything for. We were just born with them versus someone who was just born with wealth. I mean, they're on par essentially. Certainly, you do want people with greater ability, no matter what their financial status, doing things because that's going to bring the greatest benefit to the world at large. Now, there will, because of wealth, say disparities, of course, be situations where people who with genuine, real ability, real talent, oddities, in lower class families or lower class environments or poverty stricken environments, have tremendous ability, and they will be locked out too, and that will be unfair. But on the other hand, many of you might have seen that this series on teenage or child prodigies. I believe his name is Calvin Doe, a young man. I think he must be in his late teens by now because the video was made when he was 15. Who from the Ivory Coast in West Africa, and he is essentially a genius inventor. He takes. I could never do that. He takes bits of trash and rubbish. And puts them together and turns them into radios, telecommunication devices. He really has just a genius ability to forge useful and advanced mechanical parts and devices out of, well, quite literally trash. And I know he was he did for a few weeks some sort of MIT sponsored exchange where he could work in the laboratories there. And so in this case, this guy's ability was so good that he came under the spotlight, and I'm hoping in the future that MIT gives him a full scholarship and a full ride. I mean, that's an example, perfect example of someone born to extreme poverty, but whose mind is so great that MIT or any other institution would be foolish to overlook that. But so in some sense, if the ability is so great, I mean, as in the case of Calvin Doe, his ability was able to sort of extend out of his financially poor circumstances, and people became aware of him. And I think once again that allows for greater results. And still, of course, there will be people who are overlooked who just don't have the opportunities. But what social justice warriors don't acknowledge or really understand is that it is not, in an inherently unfair world, it is not possible to achieve fairness. We have different abilities, different tastes, different access to resources, and all you end up with is fairness collateral damage. However, if you decide to pit things in sort of class struggle where it's actually where you demonize, and once again we talk about these polarities, you demonize one group of people, then yeah, this is what's going to happen. I'll give you another example, two other examples. Now, in Indonesia as well as the Philippines, particularly in Indonesia, there's for a long time been a small Chinese minority, ethnic minority that stays for the most part relatively Chinese, but does better than, well, the natives. They do a lot better. There are different reasons, theories for this. I think that East Asians have biologically that is inherently high IQs, and that's probably the reason. That is to say, the ethnic Chinese in Indonesia probably are just smarter than the native Indonesians on average, and allowing for their success. And what happens here? Well, you get class envy. Their intelligence allows them to acquire greater resources, to do better, to be more successful. And therein one finds this notion of class struggle. So often, and this has happened for a long time, the ethnically Chinese inhabitants of Indonesia are targeted either by violence, verbal, physical, and you have this class hatred of them because they just do better than everyone else. And this has been true of other groups in the world as well. And this is to a lesser extent true in the Philippines, where you have a small ethnic Han or Chinese population there. So if you can ignore and bypass the notion of fairness collateral damage if you if you just say they're bad people, just like rich people are bad people, or this group of people they're bad people, then it doesn't really matter. And this is why for one reason among many others, that I tend to be more sympathetic with the right-leaning side of things, because it's apart from my gay comparative literature friend, you don't hear very much about the collateral damage, because I don't think people who are fighting for so-called social justice warriors, who are fighting for so-called equality, care very much about the collateral damage that happens on the other end. And there is, like I said, the optimal result almost necessarily would have to be a result that benefits the world and humanity at large the most. And it's hard to argue that someone with inferior ability is going to benefit versus someone with some, even if percentage is 10% better at said task or said group of tasks than someone else, that the inferior person is going to be of greater benefit. He might feel better as an individual, he might enjoy a better life, but ultimately, on aggregate, you're going to have some kind of loss. And this is something that I think really should be addressed, and not with arguments of equality of opportunity. There is no such thing. Everything is unfair. There's no equality of opportunity. It just does. This is pure mythology. There's neither equality of outcome nor equality of opportunity. Neither of these things exist. And because of that, I think the best way to go about this, and I'm completely unsure about this, mind you, completely, is to simply let the chips fall as they may, for the most part. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't, but individuals or organizations, if they're able to pull together funds without, well, in a private fashion, charities shouldn't engage in charities in an attempt to uplift people who are born into poor resource situations and so on and so forth. But the groupism, one ethnic group, one social group, one so on so versus another, and this of course inherently linked to tribalism. It's all linked together, but this is not going to produce optimal results. Now, you might interject and say, well, Stardust, humans aren't interested in optimal results, and well, if you say that, I'd agree with you. We don't really seem to be interested in optimal results. We let ourselves be blindsided and led astray constantly on numerous issues, and this is just one of many. So the optimal result would have to be the person with the best ability doing whatever he's best at. And we should acknowledge that there is going to be fairness collateral damage. And maybe, a compromise might be two individuals compete for some job. The guy with the better ability gets the specific job, but at the same time, there might be another position which is almost as good that can be offered to the other job, and the employer thinks the other guy's perfect. But ultimately, there will never be fairness. There will be no equality of opportunity, no equality of outcome. It doesn't matter what we're talking about. We could be talking about PvP shooters, where people talk about games. There's a pay to win where you can buy expensive equipment. Yeah, that helps a lot, but And they say that's not fair. No, it's not fair. It's also not fair that some people are 14 years old and have been growing up on shooters and are just a lot better and have better reflexes than everyone else. I mean, there's nothing fair about this equation. Okay, so I think I've covered fairness for the most part. But so moving into a kind of a segue of fairness and justice, because they're in some way intimately related if we want to talk about these abstractions at all as if they were to exist. MRAs say campaign for equality under the law. Well, once again, given that nothing is fair, save death, and our perceptions of different human beings are also constantly highly differentiated. I mean, we perceive women to be different from men, and it's not just because they have a vagina and we have dick and balls. We know cognitively, these days, those of us who are willing to acknowledge it, we know that we behave differently, and so we know that there are differences. Given these differences, how can there be any such equality under the law? And this, like I said, this segues into something else. Let's talk about justice. we have a system that we call the justice system, and if we go back in time, once again, I think the notion of justice probably originates in these small hunter-gatherer groups in a similar setting. It's the one of fairness. I mean, fairness and justice are kind of interconnected. They're interlinked on some level, not identical, but very similar. But I'm here to argue that the justice system is a misnomer. I've talked about unfairness and the fact that there is nothing fair, and there's not really very much we can do anything about it. And yet we have a justice system that states, for the most part, there are of course always extenuating circumstances. I'm not a lawyer, but that if you commit X crime under a certain set of circumstances, this is the punishment. Given the multitude of origins we all have, our different abilities, our different backgrounds, our different biochemistry, our different hormones, our different neurology, how can this be the case? How can we perpetuate so-called justice if this is the case? I'll give you a concrete example. Now, ultimately, our brains are... I do not want to turn this into a discussion of free will. I've talked about this a lot. But it is somewhat related. But I'll give you an example, a concrete example. We know, for example, that interference in the prefrontal cortex, say with tumors, these examples exist, can create erratic sociopathic behaviors in individuals. What if, in this scenario, they catch a serial killer who kills 4 or 5, 6, 7 people, and then they examine him and they notice that he has a huge, almost golf ball sized tumor lodged in his brain, and the neurologists and neuroscientists consult and confirm that this is almost to a 99% degree certainty responsible for his erratic, sociopathic, murderous behavior. Now, this is a difficult situation because the very notion of punishment is, in retributive justice, is this idea that should we punish? We need to sort of. It's almost a desire to create equality. A crime is committed, we try to equalize that crime by exacting punishment. Now, should we punish a man or a woman in this case, or either a person that we know committed the crimes because of a neurological disorder? In this case, he had a huge tumor lodged in his brain. And upon removal of this tumor, he's perfectly normal, very peaceful, calm, nice guy. Was he responsible for his actions? It'd really be hard to argue that he was responsible for his actions in this particular context. How would you argue that a man with a tumor affecting his behavior could possibly be responsible in any sense for his actions? So, and of course, the justice system would try to exact punitive vengeance on him, and the individuals who suffered the crime, or the loved ones, the families and the friends who lost people would want to exact vengeance on them too. Now, I'd argue this is a pretty primitive feeling. Vengeance. When I was younger, I was a very envious, vengeful person. I resented and, in some cases, hated people of greater ability. I'll never forget when I was much younger, there was a guy named Jules, a French guy. He happens to work for the European Aerospace Institute. He's a PR guy. He's not dumb, but he's not particularly bright. He's a very good-looking guy, tall, attractive. Women always swooned. I'm looking back at this retrospectively. This is 10, 15 years ago. This guy, and at the time, I was always envious. And I really hoped that he failed at something. And I think this is a related issue. I mean, suffering, this idea that suffering be inflicted on you, the suffering goes back to the person who inflicted the suffering. That's what the justice system is based on. But how is it just to punish a man, in this very extreme case, who had a tumor basically regulating what he was doing? It's not. So what is the justice system ultimately in this sense? Well, it's not just. I ultimately think that it should be called a deterrent system. This is once again a complex issue. I think I gave you an extreme example of a tumor modifying a person's behavior in such a way that he commits murderous acts of rampaging violence, but ultimately the circumstances interacting with our own biochemistry and neurology will lead to different results, and there will be similar cases, maybe not as extreme, where you get something like this. I mean, plain insanity, for example. Effectively, this is a kind of insanity, but that doesn't happen very often. So what is the justice system really ultimately? It's kind of a deterrent system more than it is a justice system. I mean, it's there because sane people without neurological disorders, people with normally regulated biochemical systems, these people probably, even if they were in the temptation to do something, would not do it. I mean, many of you might remember, I remember when I was growing up in the Bronx, a kid. I never did it actually, but remember when gum and candy and Skittles and M&Ms, they cost 50 cents a pack, and I knew I might be able to slip one in. I was 7 or 8 or whatever into my pocket. I never did it because I fear the consequences. And so it's less about, I think, stealing in this case is wrong or killing people is wrong than the deterrent, and people fear the consequence. Now, personally, I feel I've been in fights in my life, and during the fight you feel great and you have the adrenaline pumping and the testosterone going, but after the fight, I really felt bad for being injured and then causing injuries to other people. It was a horrible feeling. I don't like hurting people. I know that. So that's another issue as well. And I assume that's because I'm neurologically intact, at least partly, Joke there. So yeah, this is an issue of do we have a deterrent system or do we have a justice system? Is it right to punish people? Let me give you another example. Let's have a scenario where, for the denizens of Australia, for example, this happens. Someone is killed and swallowed whole, or well, that's not what crocodiles do, but by a saltwater crocodile, they're drowned and flung and torn to pieces. Anyway, now, would the family of the dead, deceased individual feel anger, resentment, and hatred towards this specific crocodile? Well, it's certainly possible, but no. Rather than feeling hatred, most likely they would feel caution. They would certainly feel loss, sadness at the loss of their loved one, child, son, brother, whatever. But in the same light, in the same token, it would be an idea of exercising caution. Don't go near this creek, this lagoon, because we have these man-eating saltwater crocodiles here. We would never attribute agency or responsibility to a crocodile. And I suppose you could argue, well, they're not very bright, and yeah, I guess to some degree that's true. But then the minute it's about human beings, the minute we start talking about human beings in this context, we start talking about retribution, and we get angry towards individuals for doing certain things, when ultimately they were just being led by their own unique brain chemistry. I mean, just as we should fear and shun a man-eating saltwater crocodile, but not feel resentment or feelings of vengeance towards him or her or it, so too should we, in my personal opinion, apply the same thing to human beings. A dangerous person is just that, a dangerous person, but he's not really worthy of our loathing or our hatred or our vengeance. In particular for neurologically disturbed individuals, whether you punish them or not is not going to change their minds or their mindsets. Their mindsets are fairly set, unless in the case you have the one I mentioned before, where you could remove a tumor. And in such a case, you would still have these family members quite possibly saying, look, we need to punish this guy, but what for? I mean, he was doing things outside of his control. So things become a lot blurrier, a lot more complicated once you factor in that as well. The fact that on some level, we're not responsible for what we're doing. So the best way to describe the justice system is not to call it a justice system at all, because once again, from the ground upwards, no fairness, no equality of opportunity, no equality of outcome, but a deterrent system. If we as a society, a civilization, couldn't remove the tumor from the guy, then we should lock him away for the sake of, the collective, and I hate that word, but yeah, for the sake of groups of people and individuals who might fall victim to his pathologically murderous behavior, just because it's safer that way. But that doesn't warrant feelings of vengeance or hatred. And just like, with regards to the fairness issue, the envy, I mean, the green monster, I think it can destroy you. I mean, I'm like I said, when I was much younger, I was a very envious person. So, and what happened with Elliot Rodgers? I mean, ultimately, all born from envy, and resentment. Sure, coterminous in many ways. Negative feelings that probably served a very useful purpose within the context of a small hunter-gatherer group, because you could talk to the other individuals and say, no, give me my third of the mammoth steak as well, but it doesn't really help very much. And the fact that and for the most part, we can't change it. I mean, the most obvious examples, I mean, there are data that suggests, there have been numerous studies that suggest that taller people, specifically men, earn anywhere from 10 to 15% more on average than shorter people doing the same kinds of work. And this is because, evolutionary reasons that people look up to taller people as leadership positions and so on and so forth. But you can't grow taller. Well, you can. There's some really dangerous operations for that. I'd love to understand quantum theory. I know I never will. I don't have the mental capacity for that. But I have to accept that. There's no point in getting angry towards people who do. In fact, maybe I can benefit, and they can explain in such a simplified manner that I actually understand. And by the way, a side note, it's really annoying when people talk about quantum theory, when I'm sure that 99% of the population doesn't have a fucking clue about it, including myself. But anyway, destructive forces, and it seems odd and it seems indifferent, but for the best possible result, getting back to the fairness issue, a live and let live and leave it be policy seems to be best. But there are exceptions. Like I said, I think exceptional ability should certainly counteract and surpass, in terms of that person being selected, wealth, even though that's another aspect of unfairness in life. So a lot of complicated things, but as you can see, I'm not very sympathetic toward the social justice cause. I don't even think there's a concept of there's nothing just in life. We're all kind of just conscious matter running around being directed by forces outside of ourselves. There's nothing particularly just about that. Anyway, I think I'm going to be finishing this up now. Forthcoming video, I don't know when, which will be scripted. This was off the cuff. Much more complicated, where I will be delving into not identical issues, but similar issues, and it should be quite detailed, far more detailed than this one. So anyway, as always, thanks for watching. And if you watch this, Steve to Work, I can't contact, I've tried to write to you numerous times. I saw your donation, and that has got to be the most generous donation I've ever received. So thank you very, very much, Steve to Work. That's greatly appreciated, immensely appreciated. Yeah, it really shows me that you appreciate what I'm doing, and it's just exceptionally generous. It's fantastic. Thanks a lot, Steve to Work. Until the next time, as always, may the gods watch over you, and may the summers, no, we're in spring in the north, but may the Australians enjoy their fall/autumn and winter. I wish I were in the southern hemisphere now. Everyone take care. Bye-bye.